call the honourable member for Warringah.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. First of all, I would like to commend the Chair of the Environment and Energy Committee, Mr Ted O'Brien MP, for conducting this inquiry in quite exceptional circumstances caused by COVID-19. I would also like to thank the member for Clark, my colleague on the crossbench, Mr Andrew Wilkie MP, for introducing this bill and enabling a very important debate. The National Greenhouse and Energy Reporting, Transparency in Carbon Accounting Bill 2020 seeks to amend the National Greenhouse and Energy Reporting Act from 2007 to ensure transparency and accountability in the way the Australian Government reports carbon emissions. To achieve this aim, the bill amends the reporting requirements of greenhouse gas emissions to include Scope 3 emissions, which are the indirect greenhouse gas emissions arising as a consequence of the activities of a facility. And requires the Minister to table Australia's national greenhouse gas emissions inventory estimates in Parliament every 3 months. Now, although I declined to dissent for the report in relation to this bill, I will make some general comments on the bill. I support many of the remarks that were made in the committee's advisory report, and I agree that at this time measuring Scope 3 emissions is likely to be costly, complicated and may result in inaccurate estimates. However, given the value shown by some evidence presented to the committee, there should be further consideration of the bill and measurement of Scope 3 in general, as circumstances and methodologies evolve. So the committee learnt that Scope 3 emissions are significant in general, because Scope 3 emissions dwarf Scope 1 and 2 emissions by up to 40 times at a company level in some cases. At a country level, evidence presented to the committee estimated that Scope 3 emissions associated with Australian fossil fuel exports could be up to 5% of global emissions. Various inquiry participants provided evidence showing that measuring Scope 3 emissions is a growing practice in top Australian companies. So the fact that Australian companies are measuring emissions means that it is a material consideration in their business operations, their decision-making for their shareholders, and must therefore be of inherent value. Indeed, we can look at the news and we see weekly reporting on companies being compelled to disclose Scope 3 emissions or sign on to climate targets, including on Scope 3, by their shareholders. We see climate risk becoming a material consideration for directors in exercising their duties, and this will include some consideration of Scope 3 emissions. And we also see scope emissions being factored into planning decisions on major projects. So clearly, Scope 3 emissions is something that needs to be dealt with and a plan needs to be developed. By creating uniformity in the measurement of Scope 3, we can be ahead of the trend and provide investors, shareholders, communities and businesses with certainty in a transition economy. The committee also heard evidence from individuals and stakeholder groups as to the value of Scope 3 for informing the public. I agree. The public should know the true extent of Australia's impact on global emissions. Without knowing, the public cannot make an informed choice at elections and for what to advocate. I expect demand for this knowledge will grow as society becomes more and more concerned with climate impacts. It flies in the face of the frequently asserted position by the coalition that being only 1.3% of global emissions, we can't possibly be expected to take actions. What this ignores is that on a per capita basis, we are one of the highest emitters. And as a result, we do bear a responsibility for what emissions, what our Scope 3 emissions are overseas as a result of our export industries. But I accept that for the moment, the IPCC has not included Scope 3 or a standardised methodology for assessing that. Inquiry participants stress the importance of measuring Scope 3 emissions, particularly in respect to the transition to a net zero economy, something that I strongly advocate for. I agree we must now know, we do need to know how reliant we are on fossil fuels in order to plan for a transition. We must also understand how exposed Australian exports are as other countries commit and transition to a net zero economy, and we do need to be able to pivot accordingly. The second portion of the bill would compel the minister to table the quarterly greenhouse gas estimates in the House 15 days after publication, and that the release of the data is handed to the regulator, whereas formerly under the department. On this aspect, the committee received evidence that the release of the estimates happened on average 46 days after they are currently required to be released. This is unacceptable, and I would call on the Minister and the Government to fix this as soon as possible. This is important information that the public should have access in a timely way, as stipulated by legislation. It's essential that the public remain informed as to Australia's emissions and progress towards Paris targets. Climate change policy and data are too important to be politicised. Therefore, I support measures in the second portion of the bill which would hand the coordination of the data to a clean energy regulator. Lastly, this inquiry was conducted under a very compressed time frame, and very limited evidence was able to be heard by the committee. With only one public hearing and a handful of submissions, the Australian public would be much better served with a more thorough investigation of this matter. We all know our emissions, whether they be domestic or international, are an issue that needs to be addressed. We need to find ways of making sure they are properly accounted for and published, and make sure the Australian public is properly informed. To this end, I will be presenting to Parliament later this year in November the Climate Change Bill, which will in fact address this reporting framework and the delays we currently have in the system, and establish a sound legislative framework to ensure we have proper reporting, proper risk assessment, proper adaptation and resilience plans, but most importantly, proper mitigation to ensure we get to net zero. Thank you.